Acting President and Vice President Peter, our former patron and honorary member Sir Eric, Rotarians and guests. It is my particular pleasure to formally introduce our Rotarian Doug as our guest speaker for today's luncheon. Is that right?
Yeah, keep it right up there.
Thanks for that. As a number of our members would know, Doug and I have a very close and strong friendship, and for that reason it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Doug today, and particularly as I was his nominator to join this club some 17 years ago. Doug's biographical details have been circulated in the bulletin, and in the interest of time I'll only refer to his more significant roles and achievements. Before doing so, I should mention that Doug has been an active member of the Rotary Club of Adelaide for some 17 years, as we heard earlier, and has served on a number of committees during that time. He's a very strong family man, married to Trudy, with 2 adult sons. Doug's impressive military background is well known to a number of our members, which together with his academic qualifications has allowed him to pursue a very successful career in a range of roles and industries, including Executive Director of the Institution of Engineers, the professional body for engineers, some of which our members belong to. The Chief Executive Officer of the Construction Industry Training Board, which Doug successfully handballed to Steve Larkins 10 years ago. And of course is the CEO of the Masonic Homes for some 11 years. The subject of Doug's address is the Masonic Homes and an insight. And I'm sure that Doug will refer to the strong association over many years of past and present members with that organisation. Rotarians and guests, would you please welcome Doug.
Thank you, Dick, for your kind words. Acting President, President-elect Peter, our honorary member Sir Eric, Rotarians and guests, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words today. And just between you and I'm absolutely terrified about this microphone, okay, and where it's going to be. See? So are they. As Dick said, this club has had a very long association with Freemasonry going back over many years. Of course, starting with our past patron Sir Eric, past chairmen being Brian Cole, Ray Clark, Dale Carman, Dick Mackay, Tony Hughes, David Brooks. Some of those current members, some past members, and sadly some of those have passed on to higher levels. Past directors, staff, and those associated: John Burkle, of course, Peter Neal, Tony Robins, Colin Bridson, James Sarah, Elizabeth Clare, Austin Taylor, Andrew McLaughlin, Jack Freeman, Chris Mitchell-Moore, John Oswald, Charlie Siciliano and Simon Drew. And I'm sure I look forward to reading in the bulletin next week those people that I've missed naming by name. But if I can just say that we have, this club, had a very long association with Masonic Homes. What I'd like to do today is the agenda over the next 20 minutes or so, talk about the origins of Masonic Homes, the journey that we've been on for near 50 years, where Masonic Homes is today, its future, and then I trust the opportunity for questions. And I should recognise from the outset that my replacement, at least in the acting CEO role, but my former deputy and Chief Finance Officer for some near 4 years, Richard Porter's my guest here today. So I told him that I wouldn't drop him in any clag, and I know that there's even a director or two in the audience, but I thought I'd just run through the process of where we're at. Our origins. The origins of Masonic Homes actually start back in late 1885. W.H. Gray, back in 1885, made a donation to Freemasonry of 14 acres of land down in North Glenelg. And his contribution then was to really provide a contribution of land, then valued at some £2,000, 14 acres in North Glenelg, which was intended to be for destitute Freemasons, their wives and children. The aim of that, if you read the actual what was in the record, it was aimed to cement the fact that as people came into Glenelg, they would always see an iconic Masonic Freemasonry precinct representing the benevolence of Freemasonry. Sadly, earlier this century, the government actually assumed that land, and it's now the site of the Glenelg sewerage works. So every time you flush that button, please think of Freemasonry and the benevolence of Freemasonry. But that's where it all started. And Freemasonry, over a very long time, contributed to benevolent purposes to support those of lesser means in our community. But Freemasons in 1993 determined that they would look to establish a seniors living community here in South Australia. And here on the screen is the text of what was at the Grand Communication in 1992. And John Oswald tells me he remembers this very fondly. That was a joke, John. That the Grand Lodge hereby undertakes authorises the Board of Grand Purposes to establish Masonic Memorial Village with the object of providing homes and other social amenities for Freemasons, their wives or widows and dependents, and such other persons as the Board may from time to time admit thereto, and for this purpose to set up a separate fund to be called the Masonic Memorial Village Fund, to be administered by the Board, and hereby authorises the Board to establish and carry on such a village and pledges to support in such an undertaking, and authorises the Board to take all such steps as it may deem expedient to this end, including the purchase of land suitable for the purpose. That was in 1962, and that led then to the acquisition of the Somerton Park site, which I understand then on Diagonal Road was a market gardens. It was actually also has an easement for a railway line through the middle of that site that originally had been planned for a rail line. In 1965, in fact the 6th of February, the then Grand Master Canon Robert Ray opened the first of the developments at the Somerton Park Masonic Memorial Village. And speaking seriously for a moment, I grew up as a young kid at St Mary's. My father was a Freemason, and I know that many people, and I expect many in this room, will have had some association with the Somerton Park site. Quite often it will have been because grandma or grandpa actually were there, mother or father or maybe grandfather, actually participated in the various fetes that were held on that site. But down at Somerton, it was actually an iconic site back in the 60s through to the 80s of really supporting older people. Here are the first ladies that moved into the first 12 units. Ralph Newman, the then chairman, was there presenting the keys to the first of the residents. You'll note, gents, they're all females, they're all widows, okay? And that tells a story. The units themselves, they were good 1960s cream brick construction, very modest in what they offered. The village interface with the community, again, was this is where Somerton Park was over those years, principally around cream brick, one-bedroom bedsits. In the mid-80s, Masonic Homes extended its operation out into Ridgehaven. This is an aerial view of Ridgehaven looking to the west, 25 acres out there, 90 principally one-bedroom units, and a very modest nursing home. Up until that time, Masonic Homes was characterised by the fact that it was supported by the federal government's Aged and Disabled Persons Housing Act. The Aged and Disabled Persons Housing Act was actually enacted by the Menzies government, because they identified in the 50s, in fact, Sir Keith Wilson, the grandfather of one of our members, and named in his honour, Keith Wilson, was the member for Sturt at the time. And he raised with the Prime Minister the fact that in the late 40s and early 50s, that a lot of the widows of the World War I veterans had been forgotten by their communities. The veterans had passed, and they were living in quite destitute circumstance, often in all sorts of back streets in cities and country towns. Menzies, who never served in the First and Second War, but of course had a great involvement in the Second War, felt somewhat of a guilt and decided that he would contribute, or the government would contribute, $2 or $3 to each not-for-profit that actually provided for housing of older persons, principally these widows. It was also welfare and charity based, because back in those times, older people by definition of age alone were a welfare class. And the concept of looking at charity in Freemasonry was because in those days it was actually often the Freemasons who actually laid the bricks, mowed the lawns, collected the rent, and did the various activities that were required to provide for a community. Aged widows, because, as I said, the blokes tended to pass on before they, well, if not before, they actually retired, actually soon after, and often it was the widow who was left, often in that destitute circumstance, to provide where to go. The housing circumstance itself, it was a housing option Masonic Homes started, as with all of the not-for-profit aged care providers, to provide appropriate housing for these older ladies. Principally single bedroom, quite often just a bedsit situation. And it was a very paternal environment in which the Masonic Homes was established back in the early 60s, which was, at the end of the day, the fellas knew best. They were good times. The fellas knew best and would provide for the needs of those needy ladies. But things changed. What we found is that as we moved through the 80s, the later 80s, the government, actually the Hawke government, withdrew the government assistance to housing, and they brought in Commonwealth rental assistance. It moved to more a user pays arrangement rather than the government being able to pay for things. Good thing. It was more about aged couples and singles, not just a gender-based basis on the issue of looking at widows. Care services became a need, because originally when Masonic Homes was established, and this is true of all of the aged care, what are probably now countenanced as aged care providers, is that as the aged widows became older, a need for care grew, and we then had the concept of nursing homes that evolved from that, as you needed some form of communal care that could no longer be provided for in those bedsits. Whilst government didn't provide housing assistance, the government did provide funding assistance for the care of older people. Really something that only emerged in the 80s and principally was founded in 1997 by the Howard government with the then Aged Care Act. Community housing expectations also increased, which was a good thing, and we were replaced with we had a paternal-based system replaced with a highly regulated system. So by the mid-80s, that earlier welfare-based, paternal, good, charitable system had been replaced by a much more structured, much better funded, but more regulated arrangement. So where does that take Masonic Homes now? Many of you have been on this journey because you've had the involvement with the homes, but Masonic Homes now has capital that invests in retirement villages, develops property based around retirement villages, and is a manager of those retirement villages. The key features of Masonic Homes. Today, Masonic Homes operates over 900 seniors living units in a range of offerings, from still some of those one-bedroom bed sets, because that's sometimes the affordable offering, through 2 or 3 bedroom apartments and villas, and a variety of housing offering. Because one of the things that actually older people are is they're individuals. And the fact is they're as individual as an older person as they were when they were a younger person. And the problem that we have in our community is a mindset that assumes once you become grey or lose your hair, and I aspire to go grey, then what you find is that people assume you're just like everyone else. In fact, Bernard Salt tells me, probably one of Australia's key marketers, that from the age of 15 through to 60, marketers segment the market by 5-year segments. So they look at saying every year the market evolves, or every 5 years the market evolves to a new need until you're 60. Once you get to 60, you're the same no matter whether you're 60 or 90. And the reality is that actually we're still very much individuals, and it is an issue that we need to address. And Sir Eric raised with me, Sir Eric, before we started the meeting, about the issue of Danielle tried to find a 90th birthday card for her grandpa. She had to buy a 50th and a 40th because she couldn't find a 90th. Her mathematics held true. Eric said he preferred 330s, but anyway, that's how it rolled out. Well, the reality is, for those who are investors, I mean that's most in this room, invest in 90-year-old birthday cards because there's a growing market, I can assure you. We have about 600 units in development, or Richard does. Operate currently 3 seniors living communities here in South Australia and the Northern Territory, with 3 under consideration for either acquisition or development. Equity of about 115 million. Geographic presence at this stage is SA in the Northern Territory. Gross assets of 300 million. And in my last 10 years, we've progressed about $200 million in development, and Richard's challenge going forward is to actually embrace about another 200 million in development. By my readings, if we were a listed enterprise, we'd be certainly in the top 10 businesses here in South Australia, and you'd be in the ASX 200 if you were looking at a listed enterprise. It's a big business, which is something which the state should be proud of, and certainly I am, and all those who've been involved. Around South Australia, or at least Adelaide, we have out at Ridgehaven, we've got Northgate, the Lightsview development, Somerton Park, really that lighthouse development, Walnut Grove in Old Ranella, and Hillsview down at Happy Valley. How could I forget that? The sort of environments, living environments we now have are about bright, conventional, airy. There's a range of offerings, whether it's apartments. I was in Darwin with Richard only yesterday, and people tend to look at it and say, what older people want is a 2-bedroom villa with a single garage. Well, that's true, some do. Some actually want an apartment because they don't want to be on the ground floor, because they don't want a garden and they want some security. Some don't want a villa because they don't have a car. They just want to have a little courtyard. And as I said, they're all about being individuals. The sort of living environments that older people have, and I had discussions with many people where you look at housing product which was structurally sound. But the fact is that no longer did it meet the market need. And it is that people have an expectation now, and with smart design, that what previously would have been a bedsit, you can now design in a much more effective manner and provide a much more supported housing option for those older people. Of course, the issue around community is retirement village, which Masonic Homes operate, is about bringing out people, and it is about the community. It's not just about the built form. So it is providing those spaces and those amenities that people can actually go and engage and remain active. Because one of those things, and I know a number of you here have retired, is it is about maintaining that activity, both physical and mental. Who knows, you know, all of us can give names of people who've retired and then shuffle off this mortal course soon after because they determined that once they had retired that they really had no further use on this planet. I thought it would be worthwhile to talk just quickly demographics, and I don't know if people can see that, probably not. But that's what the age structure was back in 1950s, okay? About the time that Masonic Homes was established. What I'm trying to illustrate there is when you look at people above, above 80, so down that bottom there, they're almost irrelevant. They're almost irrelevant. Statistically insignificant, because what our focus was back in the 50s was around with baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer, that's good. But as we move through the years, we see it moving. And not what we have today is in fact almost 3% of the population are aged 85 and above. So Eric, so you're not alone, okay? So Danielle, those 90 birthday cards for you, I'd invest in them, okay? Maybe electronic, because with your partner I know he's into technology. So, but it's certainly moving. But if you go back, if you go forward a little bit further to the year 2057, which will be the year of my centenary, and I declare here, and please I'm happy to put it in the bulletin, you're all invited to my birthday party on the 28th September 1957. You too, Sir Eric. 2057. 2057, you're all invited to my 100th birthday. But if you look then, what we're talking about is people aged over 85 is going to be verging on 5% of the population. So our structure has really changed, and older people are really about where the future's going to be. We covered the issue around the built form, but you look at the people and what Masonic Homes is about. I think this is true of all older care and housing options, is it's about the people. They're active, they're still contributors. The reality is that often they're the informal carers. They're often the volunteers, principally they're the volunteers, and they've got great experience. So as I come to the end of my time, I said I'd talk about the future a little bit. I just list, first of all, the demographics. The demographics are changing, and what we're finding is that older people no longer are an insignificant rump on our society. The baby boomers actually created a whole new generation, a generation that didn't exist before, and we've now got that generation in the active retiree. Customer expectations have increased, and customers' capacity to pay has also increased. Access to capital for not-for-profits is an enormous issue. Certainly complicated by the global financial crisis, and people will often look at a not-for-profit and say, well, that's good, you don't have to pay tax. But you only pay tax on your profits, and the only source of capital for a not-for-profit is retained earnings or dumb bank debt. It's very difficult to bring in new equity, and that's going to have some enormous issues. Masonic Homes is actively, and people will be aware, is looking at whether it should stay in the not-for-profit space or is it in its best interest, and for that of seniors to actually move into being a for-profit operation, and maybe the paying of tax on profits may be a lesser of two evils. The issue of regulation is also one. I declare a personal view, and I'm talking here not as the CEO of Masonic Homes, but as the former CEO of Masonic Homes and as Doug Strain. I think that regulation can just actually stifle what people need, and the issue around caveat emptor becomes quite often what we need to look at, rather than assuming regulation will solve the problem. I think sometimes caveat emptor, and it's educating our consumers. Competition and consolidation of the industry is inevitable, in my view, and the issue around innovation. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I just conclude, Masonic Homes image is around helping people live healthier, happier and longer, being a can-do organisation. I did have to put a bit of marketing up there, but certainly if I pass back to our chairman for the day, if there are any questions. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak to the members today.
Thank you very much, Doug, for that. It certainly has been a journey. And I think for all those members that are a member of this club and been a part of that journey, you should be very proud. Doug, thanks for the invitation for 2057. I might just pass on to my oldest grandson, and he'll pass on his compliment, or my compliments. We do have 1 or 2 minutes for questions, members and guests. So if you have any questions, just put your hand up. John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, I guess this is a general question. How do you see the future of aged care in Australia? There's a lot of debate about it. A lot of it's negative, a lot of it's positive. There's conflict over government funding, how much there should be. This is a terribly broad-based question. You're probably able to answer it more frankly now than you were previously. There's hairs on the question, but do you have any strong views about that?
Thanks, John. And the question was around about, you know, what will be the future of aged care and seniors housing going forward. John said, you know, have I got any views? And it's a bit controversial. The reality is that we are facing, there are fundamental changes in the way that our economy is structured and where our capital is based. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, let's, you know, be honest, the majority of older people had desperately struggled, and I'll declare my family connection. My grandparents desperately struggled to pay off their house so that at the end of the day they could get a pension and not have to rent a home. And Grandpa retired at 65, and I remember him as a very frail old man at 65. He died at 69. Okay, in the last couple of years, my recollection is he spent with a heart condition in bed. My grandmother then lived for a few more years. Sadly, she had a ubiquitous stroke, ended up in a nursing home and then shuffled off soon after. The reality is the wealth of this nation is moving to older people. And what older people have to do is to take more responsibility for funding the needs that they have. Sure, there's a lot of older people who actually are of very modest means. We need to support those. But what we do have, and I think the government, whether people like it or not, I'm not sure they've sold it that well, and I know your connections, John, but the reality is about those debates occurring in our community. Because when you've got the argument around the retirement age, and the retirement age being now moved to 70, well, I'm sure you've all seen it in the media. I mean, when they brought in the retirement age, people died at, you know, 58 or whatever it was. It wasn't expected you'd retire. Nowadays, we baby boomers, and there's many of us here in the audience, we expect to have a generation in retirement before we get old. And we can't expect the government, we can't expect young people to fund that. I look in this room at the Sarahs and you say, well, James loves his father and mother dearly, which is great, so he should. But does he want to make all the sacrifice for his mother and father to protect the capital so that he can have a huge inheritance at one time whenever they eventually shuffle off this mortal coil. And I know Dom and Meredith are very committed to staying. So you look at it and say, you know, why aren't people able to stay? So I think it is about changing that. That debate does need to happen, and it needs to happen in a very rational and reasoned sense. I think it's just irrational when people say, but, you know, mum and dad worked all their lives, they've generated wealth, why should they have to pay for their aged care? Well, the reality is because they can afford to do it.
Thank you very much, Doug. Unfortunately, Darcy, did you have a quick question? Or?
Just a quick one, but thanks very much for your talk. Demographics are really interesting. I believe there's some changes on July 1 about what people have to pay to enter retirement villages. And how's that going to impact on Masonic Homes Ltd?
If I very quickly answer, the changes are about the impact on nursing homes, not retirement villages. Retirement villages are in the market. It's, at the end of the day, they're not controlled by government funding. The federal government controls the funding around nursing homes, and they're lifting some of the restrictions on what operators can provide to bring in more choice in residential aged care. But retirement villages, the costs are actually in the market. We're not restricted by what the government can afford.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thanks for those questions, members. Doug, it's been a great journey. We congratulate you. We wish Richard well, and we wish you well in your new role, whatever that might be. But Rotarians and guests, would you please stand and whilst I make the usual presentation.